Self-improvement is both a societal and an individual matter at the same time, and we pretty much have our own unique self-improvement journeys depending on our starting point, which further depends on how human or subhuman you are. However, the funny thing is, even though we have individual starting points, the blueprint, the journey, the stages that we all go through, largely seem to remain consistent amongst young men. These being starting off with wanting to attract women, then going more so onto fitness and health, leading up to martial arts, and ultimately followed up by a full-on spiritual war. Or in other words, fascism. How come that the pipeline from self-improvement to fascism remains so consistent amongst young men? Let's find out. You probably started out with self-improvement. I don't even like the term anymore, to be honest, because self-improvement is it's just like living life, essentially just doing some things and trying to get better at them over time. But you initially probably started desiring progress because you wanted to attract girls, especially because you most likely started in your mid-teens, like 14, 15 or 16 years old. That's at least when it kind of started, that's kind of when it started for me. And your initial desire is simply to attract women because you're probably bad at it when you're such a young guy. And that purpose is very raw, it's very biological, it's very carnal. You simply just want to reproduce. However, it is a fairly conventional desire that we have because obviously you want to reproduce on a biological level, but even talking about a psychological level, your self-esteem is to a very large degree determined by how attractive you are or how attractive you think you are to the opposite sex. So you obviously not just want to necessarily have sex as much as possible, but you want to look out for that positive reinforcement. You want to look out for that validation, so to speak. And what is the easiest way to get sexual validation by the opposite sex? It is to improve your looks. It is to looks max, it is to get in shape, it is to have a healthy diet, but which kind of just further ties into fitness and looks maxing. But that is the lowest hanging fruit. That is the thing that is going to give you immediate reward when it comes to your sex appeal. So what usually happens is that teenagers, for instance, start really getting into lifting weights or into calisthenics, and they, get their newbie gains, get in shape, take care of their diets. Once you have managed to actually attract females, to get female validation, or to maybe even potentially have a loving and fulfilling relationship, which is a rare occurrence for lots of people these days, sadly, that desire is pretty much fed. You're not really going to be looking out for that validation anymore. And you don't really need that because your esteem has already been built. What usually happens then is that people get hooked onto the fitness journey, not because they want more and more female validation, but simply because they get addicted to that feeling of improvement, to that long-term dopamine that they're getting, to life feeling like a role-playing game because you simply acquire these new skill points and can just distribute them however you want. Fitness especially is like the most ideal way for men to see improvements because it's measurable, it's not vague. If you increase your body fat percentage, you can measure that. If you increase your weight, if you're for instance a skinny guy and you want to get big, you can actually measure your weight. If you want to get stronger, it's weight that can be measured. It's objective numbers. You have objective guidelines that you can go by. Meaning you go through a physical renaissance that actually feels fucking amazing. Especially if you started out as an out of shape guy and now managed to become a very athletic guy. After completing this stage, the carnal is pretty much done for. Because you have managed to attract the female and you have managed to build a strong and beautiful body. So your carnal, your material desires have pretty much been satisfied. And the question then becomes what happens next? Because most of you are probably not going to pursue bodybuilding or powerlifting professionally because for one, it's boring as shit. You're gonna be doing the exact same thing for decades to come. There isn't that much more to bench pressing than lifting the bar up. It gets boring pretty fast. And also because if you wanna go all in on lifting weights or bodybuilding, for instance, it takes away skill points and improvements from other more important areas of your life, such as dating, for instance, your attractiveness or the time you spend with your loved ones, because these endeavors require some sacrifices that are probably not recommended to be done by most people. So the question remaining is, what else is there to be done? What is the next stage that I can go into? And the next stage usually ends up being fighting. The physical is done. Now it is time for the mental. And fighting, in my opinion, is a lot more mental than physical because, obviously your body plays a role because you need to have some base of athleticism, but it's very much just skill acquisition, strategic thinking, and problem solving in real time. The physical is just an expression of that. But fighting is an endeavor with a very high ceiling of acquirable skills, meaning you can spend decades in there and still learn something new, which results in long-term satisfaction because you're never gonna get bored of fighting. Fighting does not become boring. It's literally impossible. There's just too much variety, too much to learn, and too many kinds of pains to experience for it to be boring. Some people get into other endeavors such as climbing, for instance, but fighting is inherently way more deeply rooted in your identity because when you start fighting, you're not just a guy who does fighting time to time, you are a fighter. You're gonna be presenting yourself as a fighter. Other people will perceive you as a fighter. That is essentially who you are going to be. Meaning, you're not just experiencing a shift in the physical by getting like cauliflower ears, for instance, but you're also like having a shift in the mental. You're actually experiencing an identity shift, which is far stronger than the physical, because the physical is temporary and it can be taken away from you pretty much simply through disease, for instance. Or if you just have an accident, right? You're going to lose your muscles pretty fast. But the mental aspects of fighting, both the skill, but also the personality that it builds, the grit that you're going to experience, is going to remain with you forever. Partying is weakness for the soul, said by the wise Conor Makin. I almost said the N-word. You see, the reason why there's such a big identity shift when it comes to fighting is because if you've been fighting for quite some time, if you have some martial arts experience, which you probably should, because if you don't, bro, you're kind of missing out. Most of the time, and I'm pretty sure that most people doing martial arts can attest to this. When you are fighting, when you're in sparring, when you're doing technique training, you're not really fighting the other person, but you're more or less just fighting yourself to keep going. You're fighting your own body. When you, for instance, shoot a double leg and the guy sprawls on you, right? It feels heavy as shit. It feels really uncomfortable. You're not really fighting the other guy. You're fighting your own body to move, because there is no real punishment if you just stay there and lose. Like, nothing's gonna happen for real, but you have to fight your own body to actually sit out or to posture up, which is demanding as hell physically. But being able to conquer yourself in these uncomfortable situations is going to result in a very long-term identity shift, because your brain can't really tell one endeavor apart from the other. Meaning it cannot tell apart the things that you do at fighting to the things that you do at cooking food, for instance. If you push through high amount of discomfort in one thing, you're gonna be doing the exact same thing in another. But of course, there's still the aspect of fighting another person off, meaning you also learn to apply your will onto something else, or in other words, to manipulate something or somebody, which is going to teach you that you are still in control of your life. Whether or not you give up that position is your choice. Whether or not you finish that guy is your choice. Fighting turns you into a fighter for life. However, the mental improvements are going to be done for the most part after some time. If you spend 2 years, 5 years, 10 years at fighting, at some point the identity is pretty much set and it's just part of your routine. It's not really going to have a big impact anymore in your life. Let's talk brushing your teeth for a moment. If you're a guy who severely suffers from depression and you barely manage to brush your teeth, brushing your teeth every day for like a month is going to do a lot for your mental improvement. However, at some point it's just going to be done and it's just going to be part of your routine. You're just brushing your teeth, you're not thinking about it. It doesn't really give you anything. You just do it because you know that it's necessary for you to do, and that it's going to be good for you in the long term because you don't want your teeth to rot. It's kind of the exact same thing with fighting. If you've been fighting for a couple of years or for a couple of decades, you're not really going to be finding many more mental improvements. You kind of just do it to keep the improvements up, to essentially just maintain what you've already gained. At the end of that stage, the carnal has been fulfilled earlier on, and now the mental, the psychological has been fulfilled too, because fighting also doesn't just come with the skill acquisition and the build of a personality, but also you're going to, obviously you're gonna be social because you cannot train fighting by yourself, so you're gonna have a strong group of friends who are also high tier people because they are doing a difficult endeavor and they're probably exceeding at it if they're sticking to it for the long run. At this point, the carnal is done, as we previously established, and the mental side of things, psychological side, is also done. Because fighting pretty much takes care of your psyche as a man. For one, you have an endeavor that allows you to build a ton of skill, meaning it's going to keep your brain stimulated, but it's also a very social endeavor because you cannot train fighting by yourself. You're always with other people in that fight gym. Meaning you will have a strong group of friends, you will have good people to socialize with, so your mental and your social needs are also pretty much set. What to do then? Because the masculine brain doesn't like to settle, it likes to keep going, it likes to keep conquering, it likes to keep looking out for a bigger mountain to climb. What is the bigger pursuit to go after? In order to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, what is the next chronological step to individual self-improvement? It is collective self-improvement, the bettering of not just yourself, but of the people around you. That could be your group of friends, your race, your ethnicity, anything. Self-improvement is essentially a cycle of life because you learn something by somebody else, you do it for some time, you get good at it, and then you teach the next generation. That is how we human beings evolve to be the way they are. That is essentially why we're so OP, because we can learn things, teach them the next generation, and give them an insane head start. They're gonna surpass us every single time because they don't just learn by our foundings, but they also learn by our mistakes. Here's the tricky part though. Improvement is not just the improvement of the internal, but also the elimination of external bad factors, so to speak. And on a societal level, the internal threats are people who want to bring us down, so essentially weak people. And the outside threat are simply enemies of ours, right? These could be enemies of your race, enemies of your culture, whatever that may be. But we have to establish that we have both internal threats and external threats that we have to deal with, and both of these will lead to improvements. And let's go back to the hierarchy of needs for a moment. So we established our physical needs first, we fed them first because they are pretty much just required for survival. You can't really live on if you're not eating, right? Or if you're not reproducing, for instance. Then we have our mental needs, our need for our brain to be stimulated, our need for social interaction. The next need that we have is the need for the spiritual, because human beings are inherently spiritual creatures. That's what sets us apart from animals. And now let's think for a moment, what people are the most spiritual? What group of people is the most inclined to dive into spirituality? Is it the capitalists? Let's think about it for a moment. The capitalism is inherently just the interest in broadening your resources, right? And just acquiring wealth and building something material. And material is the exact opposite from spiritual. Because material can be measured, spiritual cannot be measured. What happens in a capitalistic society is that we are essentially being pushed down to our more carnal needs because those are easier to sell. It is very easy to sell people food, for instance, because they need that for survival. And it's very easy to make them addicted to food because we have an inclination for that, right? We're naturally addicted to food because we literally need that. We cannot live on without food, so we may as well just make the food as dopaminic as possible so that we get hooked onto it. Same thing goes for sex, for instance, right? Sex has been capitalized like crazy because it sells. So the capitalists kind of turn away from the spiritual because the spiritual is not profitable. What about the communists? Well, the communism pretty much has the same focus as capitalism, meaning it focuses on the material. However, it doesn't really focus on acquiring material, it focuses on distribution of the material, right? So that people have equal distribution no matter their effort. And communism doesn't just ignore the spiritual. Communist countries always reject the spiritual, they always reject the faith, because the faith in something greater does not really align with the idea of equality that well. And the communism, the state, the material is kind of the highest being that there is. And if you have something that you value higher than the state, you are not going to obey. So the communists did all they could to erase religion. So who are the most spiritual people? Well, I was thinking for a bit and I came up with two conclusions for the most spiritual group of people. And for one, we have monks. People who detach themselves from material needs, people who detach themselves from the carnal, who kind of just live on, and they essentially ignore all the needs or the lesser needs that human beings have, such as their carnal or their mental needs, and they simply go all in the spiritual, which leads them to be very peaceful people, but they're very pacifist at the same time. They in a sense just accept the chaos that we are in, and they also accept the fact that we are pretty much nothing compared to the universe, and they simply observe and immerse in the chaos. They simply view themselves as a part of, as an organism, right? They just view themselves as an organism of the chaos, and they observe what is happening in the world around them and pretty much accept things the way they are. Now let me ask you a question. What do you think is the other people that is heavily interested in spirituality and in the occult? What is the other group of people? It is fascists. It was literally Hitler. Why do you think right-wing conspiracies always involve God, Satan, aliens, Nordic gods, lost lands, forgotten civilizations? Because fascism at its core likes to make us think that there's something greater than us, something beyond our imagination that we have to strive to become. That is essentially what fascism is. So the monks are essentially people who observe the chaos and simply view themselves as merely being part of it. And the fascists are people who view that chaos and think, okay, we have to somehow bend it, we have to somehow get control of it, which I think it's actually possible to do that, but it's not going to be possible in our lifetimes. We actually have to die in order to dive into that sphere first. But that is essentially the key difference in their view of spirituality. The monks accept it, the monks observe it, and the fascists, they want to dive into it, they want to control it, they want to conquer it. Fascism is a very masculine worldview to have, because fascism ultimately boils down to improvement. They wanted to improve their race, they wanted to improve their people as much as possible, and the next improvement, the next chronological improvement that you could potentially have is, going back to the hierarchy of needs, is to reach a higher plane of existence. Because if all your physical and mental needs are met, the spiritual is the only thing that is left to complete the trinity, so to speak. If you think about it, fascist Germany, for instance, was the only country that openly practiced the occult and that also openly looked out for lost lands and lost civilizations. With the Thulean society, for instance, Jews were intertwined with the government. It was not like a secret society type of thing. It was actually publicly known. It was printed on newspapers. And here's why fascism is so appealing to young men, because capitalism, our current system, really just boils down to economic growth, just the growth of pure numbers. It is important to acquire wealth to live a good life, but it only goes up until a certain point. If you have a certain amount of money, at some point your life is essentially going to be the same. It's not really going to make that much of a difference, except for people who like jerk off to their bank accounts. But we as men especially, we desire something greater. We desire something that is beyond us, that is beyond our imagination and beyond our physical. And the only worldview that appeals to that is fascism. The only two fractions that we have that actually make spirituality one of their core staple beliefs are, for one, the fascists, and for one, the most left-leaning people there are. Think like these hippie type of people, you know, that wear like yoga clothing and don't shave their armpits and shit. Like both of these guys are into spirituality. Now, picture yourself as a young man who is probably in good shape, who's probably into fighting and such. Which fraction do you think you're going to choose? Are you going to choose the woman who smells like herbs and doesn't shave her armpits and talks about just rejecting our biological needs? Or are you going to go into the fascists to promote masculine ideas? I don't necessarily want to talk good about fascism, because I personally don't really believe in political ideologies. I believe you should simply be doing the things that are going to benefit your nation. Whether these are fascists, communists, left-leaning, whatever the fuck, doesn't really matter to me. I'm not loyal to a set of beliefs. I'm loyal to doing the best thing that I can for my society. But essentially, we have one spiritual faction that completely rejects the masculine, and we have one that fully embraces it. So naturally, you're going to be inclined to be more on the fascist side. And currently, whether or not you're a left-leaning or right-leaning person, the problems that we have in the West are problems that need right-wing solutions. That's just an objective fact, right? Because you need right-wing solutions when there's too much chaos, when you need to establish more control. You need left-leaning solutions if there's too much control and you need to bring in some more chaos, some more freedom. Currently, we definitely have right-wing issues in the West, 100%. You cannot argue about that. What you have to keep in mind as well is that in the past couple of decades, we had leftist ideas being pushed onto us very hard. Things such as high degrees of empathy, of equality and such, which aren't bad ideas or anything. I'm not somebody who necessarily shoots against them, but you have to understand, if you push really, really hard to the other, because we had unreasonable amounts of empathy. Empathy in itself is good, but if you're empathetic to people who harm you, you're an idiot. If you push the pendulum hard to one side, it's gonna swing just as hard back to the other. And that's what happened 100 years ago in Germany, because before the far right took over in World War II, we had a very left-leaning, a very chaotic government. And that's just the very nature of things. It's one of the core physical laws of our world. If you throw a ball up in the air, it's gonna fall down the exact same height. It's just simple mathematics. And what do we observe with young men these days? Many of them are actually turning into religion. But which religion specifically? Because you don't really see them becoming Protestants, do you? You don't really see lots of them turning into Buddhism. They turn to either Orthodox Christianity or to Islam. These are the religions that the young men are turning into. And for a very good reason, because both of them are really strict. Both of them do not tolerate bullshit, and both of them are very dogmatic. They are authoritarian. They establish control. And that is the thing that they're longing for in this very chaotic environment that we are brought up in. And also because these religions both embrace strength and aesthetics. And aesthetics is a big part, because art, in my opinion, is the closest thing we have to the divine in our material world. Because art is not measurable, art is felt, it is observed, and it is timeless. Think music, paintings, architecture. Which group of people creates the highest quality? Well, quality in a sense of complexity, let's say. Which group of people creates the most complex architecture, the most complex music, the most complex paintings? It is people that are deeply rooted, deeply in tie with their beliefs, with their religion. And if you look at our modern / left-leaning art, it's either corporate, meaning it looks like an advertising and it has this very bland type of look, think modern day McDonald's, or it's completely chaotic and looks like it's been done by a 5th grader. Same for the music. As leftists usually do some type of punk rock, which is the least skill requiring type of music to make. And now let me ask you this, what is the most timeless, what is the most human art form that there is, found in every single culture without exception, found in every single time period, and that is never going to die off no matter what happens? It's fighting. It's martial art. There's literally art in the name. That's the reason why fighting is so addictive to men, because it's not just a skill acquisition, it's not just the thought that you can beat somebody up, but there's a certain aesthetic and spiritual path that they're... Got an airband. Get the fuck up, bro, I'm trying to record a video. Thanks. There's an aesthetic and a spiritual path that they're on. Because just as a musician or a painter wants to perfect their craft, so do fighters. It is a form of art. In my opinion, it's the most beautiful form of art. And probably in the opinions, it's the only art that resonates so hard with every single man. Because for some people can't really get things out of painting. Some people can't really get anything out of music, which is kind of strange to me. But some people are not really into architecture. But you're not gonna find a man who is not into fighting. That just doesn't really happen. I mean, same for women. If you show a woman a fight, for instance, it naturally sparks our curiosity. It is the most bridging thing between the human and the divine, in my opinion, or at least the one that resonates with most people. Some people, of course, have an individual inclination towards music or paintings, but fighting is the one that unites us the most. And just to clarify this video for a moment, it's not necessarily about young men outright calling themselves fascists or trying to apply fascism onto their own states, for instance. It's more that ideas that align with previous fascist leaders and thinkers are gaining popularity amongst young men, which is a very natural conclusion given our current historical context. And this desire is not rooted in evil. Fascism has a very bad rep, but this desire is essentially just rooted in wanting to share the acquired beauty that you have for yourself to the world, to your own people. This could potentially lead up to authoritarianism, but it is not ill-intended by any means. And in fact, I do not believe ideas to be flawed by themselves at all, to be honest. But no matter what idea, even the most pristine, perfect idea will not be able to be flawlessly executed by humans, because we humans are flawed by nature. Our spiritual side is what sets us apart from animals, but our flaws are what sets us apart from the divine. So our biology is essentially nothing more than a bridge between the material world and the divine. Our desire for the greater, for the thing that lies beyond us, is the strongest will that we have once our carnal and psychological needs are met. And the question should not be, why are young men turning to fascism? The question should be, where else are they supposed to go?